Picture this. It's the winter of 1147 in northern England, and Death is walking the countryside dressed in white. Not the romantic, snow globe kind of winter we might imagine when we think of medieval times. No, this is winter as the Grim Reaper, methodical and merciless, moving from village to village with the patience of something that knows it always wins in the end. In the village of Thornwick, a place so small it barely deserves the name village, young Harold watches his father's hands. These were hands that could swing an axe for 12 hours straight during harvest, hands that could wrestle a plough through frozen ground, hands that had never known defeat. Now they looked like parchment stretched over bird bones. The last scraps of salted pork disappeared at the feast of St. Martin, and that was, God help them, that was 2 months ago. You have to understand something about medieval winter that we've completely lost in our modern world. When we run low on food, we drive to a store. When medieval peasants ran low on food, they died. It's that simple, that brutal, that final. No safety net, no government assistance, no relatives in the next town over who might have extra grain. You made it through winter, or winter made an end of you. Across this frozen wasteland that was once green England, 3 out of every 10 souls would not see spring. Think about that ratio for a moment. Imagine if every third person you knew simply vanished between December and March. The mathematics of medieval survival were written in bones and empty cradles. The lords in their stone towers, they had a different winter entirely. Lord Aldrich of Thornwick sat in his great hall, carefully rationing stores of grain and preserved meat that could feed his household until Easter and beyond. His winter was about managing abundance, not facing death. But even the lords felt winter's bite in their own way. They knew that dead peasants meant no spring planting, no taxes, no future. Their wealth was built on keeping just enough people alive to work the land come spring. Below in the village, people were doing things that would horrify us today, boiling leather belts and saddle straps until they became a gelatinous soup, cracking bones that had already been cracked, searching for any marrow that might have been missed. Children with eyes too large for their faces stared at empty bowls, while mothers sang lullabies to quiet the crying of empty bellies. But Harold was different. Where others saw only desperation, he saw possibility. Where others accepted that winter meant death, he refused to surrender. On St. Lucy's Eve, the darkest night of the year, when even the village priest advised staying close to home and hearth, Harold made a decision that would change everything. He entered the Black Forest. Now, you need to understand what this meant. The Black Forest wasn't just another woodland. This was a place where even wolves feared to hunt, where the trees grew so thick that noon looked like twilight, where sounds carried strangely and echoes came back wrong. Local mothers threatened disobedient children with being left in the Black Forest. Grown men crossed themselves when they had to pass near its borders. But hunger makes philosophers of peasants and heroes of cowards. Harold wrapped himself in every scrap of cloth and fur he could find, took his father's hunting knife, and walked into that green-black darkness as snow began to fall. 3 hours into the forest, when the cold had numbed his feet and the snow was falling thick enough to erase his footprints behind him, Harold saw smoke. Not the clean, white smoke of a hearth fire, but thick, aromatic smoke that carried scents he couldn't identify. Following that smoke like a man following a star, he found something that shouldn't have existed. A cave, warm with firelight, and standing before it, a figure wrapped in bearskins who had not been seen at market for 20 winters. The villagers called him the Keeper, and they whispered that he was old when their grandfathers were young, that he knew things from before the Norman conquest, from before the Christian bells replaced the old drums. The hermit's cave smelled of smoke and mystery. And something else. Something that made Harold's empty stomach clench with sudden hope. The walls were lined with meats. Not just any meats, but cuts that looked as fresh as if they'd been butchered that morning. Though Harold knew no animals had been killed in these parts for weeks. Venison that bent like fresh leather, pork that gleamed with natural juices, fowl that looked ready for the spit. The Keeper spoke in the old tongue, mixing Celtic words with Latin prayers, his voice like wind through ancient oak. He claimed his knowledge came from a Roman garrison commander who had learned it from mountain tribes beyond the Rhine, techniques that predated Christ himself, methods that could make meat last not just through one winter, but through many winters, techniques that could preserve food as if time itself had been stopped. But the keeper, wise in the ways of desperate men, would not simply share this wisdom. Oh no. Harold must prove himself worthy through 3 trials that would test not just his courage, but his commitment to knowledge itself. First, he must survive a complete night in the wolf-haunted depths of the forest, alone, with nothing but his knife and his will. Second, he must find the extinct alpine starflower, a bloom that legends claimed appeared only in the deepest winter, only to those who truly needed its power. And third, most impossible of all, he must maintain a fire for 7 complete days and nights, without adding a single piece of wood, using only what he could gather in the moments before the trial began. As Harold stared at those impossible cuts of preserved meat, feeling his father's life ebbing away back in Thornwick, feeling his own strength fading with each passing day, he knew he had no choice. "I accept," he whispered, and the keeper smiled a smile older than memory. But what Harold didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined as he prepared for these trials, was that his success would do more than save his family. It would spark wars, topple guilds, change the very course of history, and ultimately exact a price that would make him question whether some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. The first trial would begin at sunset. 3 weeks later, Harold returned to Thornwick, and the man who walked back into that desperate village was not the same man who had entered the Black Forest on St. Lucy's Eve. Oh, he looked the same on the surface, same lean frame, same dark hair, same calloused hands. But his eyes held secrets now, and bundled on his back were packages wrapped in strange cloth that smelled of herbs no one in Thornwick had ever encountered. The trials had changed him. That first night alone in the wolf-haunted forest, when he'd heard howls that seemed to come from the earth itself, when shadows moved against the natural direction of moonlight, that night had taught him that survival required embracing what others feared. Finding the alpine starflower had meant climbing ice-covered rocks where one slip meant death, searching for a bloom that existed only in legend, only to discover that legends sometimes grew in the most impossible places. And maintaining that fire for 7 days without adding wood, well, that had required understanding fire itself as something alive, something that could be fed with breath and intention as much as fuel. The keeper had taught him that preservation was not simply about salt and smoke, it was about understanding the invisible war between life and decay, about learning to speak the language that wood speaks when it burns, about timing that had to align with the very breath of the seasons. Oak gave strength to meat, holding its essence like a strong man holds a secret. Applewood gave sweetness, transforming tough flesh into something that could make a king weep with pleasure. And pine, sacred pine with its golden resin, fought the invisible demons of rot themselves, demons that had plagued humanity since the first man tried to save meat for tomorrow. But when Harold fired up the abandoned mill and began his first attempts at this ancient art, the results were, well, let's just say they were not what anyone had hoped for. The first batch of meat he produced was so foul that Father Benedict, the village priest, performed a full exorcism over the building. The good father sprinkled holy water and chanted Latin prayers while villagers held cloths over their noses, convinced that Harold had invited Satan himself to take up residence in their midst. But here's what separated Harold from every other desperate soul that winter. He didn't give up. While others accepted failure as God's will, Harold adjusted. He learned to read smoke like a scholar reads manuscripts, understanding that temperature mattered to the width of a finger's shadow, that timing had to be measured not by hours but by the monastery bells that rang across the valley. Brother Thomas's calls to prayer became Harold's timing mechanism, vespers for adding pine, matins for adjusting the airflow, prime for checking the meat's progress. And then, on a morning when the first crocuses were pushing through the last snow, something magical happened. Harold opened his smoking chamber to reveal an entire stag that had been hanging there since before Lent began. The meat bent like fresh leather, yet tasted as if it had been killed that very morning. The impossible had become possible. Word spread faster than plague. First the immediate neighbours, tiptoeing into Harold's mill like pilgrims approaching a shrine, then merchants from the next village, then the next county. Within a week, minor lords were riding to Thornwick with their retinues, wanting to see this miracle with their own eyes. Within a month, emissaries from Baron Hrothgar himself were knocking at Harold's door, offering gold for his secrets. Harold's smokehouse grew like a living thing. What began as a single chamber in an abandoned mill became a complex that rivaled the church in size and certainly exceeded it in activity. 5 towers rose toward the sky, each releasing aromatic clouds that could be smelled 2 miles distant on a clear day. Travellers claimed they could navigate to Thornwick by following their noses, guided by the sweet, woody perfume that hung over the village like a blessing. But perhaps the most remarkable change was what happened to the women of Thornwick. Harold's wife, Astrid, had always been clever, but now she found herself with real power. She organized the village wives into what they called the Sisterhood of Smoke, teaching them to blend herbs with the precision of apothecaries, to monitor temperatures with the attention of master craftsmen. These women, who had never owned anything more valuable than a milk cow, were suddenly earning their own silver. Some bought their freedom from serfdom outright. Others sent their sons to learn letters from the monastery scribes. The transformation rippled outward in ways no one had anticipated. Children in Thornwick grew taller and stronger with consistent protein through winter. Infant mortality, which had claimed half of all babies before their first birthday, dropped to levels not seen in living memory. The village blacksmith found himself forging specialized smoking tools instead of just farm implements. The cooper worked overtime, crafting barrels for the preserved meats that were now being shipped as far as London. Knowledge flowed into Thornwick like tributaries feeding a great river. Solomon ben David, the Jewish merchant whose trade routes stretched from Cordoba to Constantinople, brought Mediterranean herbs that added flavors the English had never imagined. Moorish traders, following Solomon's reports, introduced sugar-smoking techniques from the courts of Al-Andalus, methods that transformed preservation from mere survival into artistry. The success attracted rivals as surely as honey attracts bears. Isabella of Normandy arrived one autumn morning, claiming her wine-wrapped preservation method was superior to Harold's smoking. She set up her own operation in the village's old brewery, wrapping meats in cloth soaked with the finest French wines, creating preservation that smelled like a feast even before cooking. Brother Thomas, inspired by his daily proximity to Harold's work, began experiencing visions during his prayers, declaring that God himself was revealing the perfect wood combinations through divine revelation. Then there was Marco Torelli, the Venetian merchant whose smile was too wide and whose questions were too specific. He tried to steal Harold's secrets through seduction, courting Harold's eldest daughter with gifts of silk and promises of life in the great trading cities of Italy. When that failed, he attempted bribery, offering Harold's apprentices more gold than they had ever imagined for just a few details about herb mixtures and timing. Harold was no fool. He had learned caution along with preservation. He trained 5 principal apprentices, including young Catherine of York, a sharp-eyed girl whose family had fled south during the Scottish raids. But to each apprentice, he taught only part of the complete method. Catherine learned the herb combinations, but not the timing. Young Peter mastered the fire management, but knew nothing of the wood sequences. This way, his knowledge was protected even as it spread. As Harold stood in his great smokehouse on the 3rd anniversary of his return from the Black Forest, watching his apprentices tend fires that never went out, breathing air thick with the perfume of preserved plenty, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had beaten winter itself, had turned death into life, had built something that would last. But satisfaction, as Harold was about to learn, can be the most dangerous luxury of all, because success that changes the world also threatens those who profit from the world as it was. And in the medieval world, threatening established power was the fastest way to find yourself branded as a heretic, a rebel, or worse. The Guild of Salters had been watching Thornwick, and they had decided that Harold's revolution had gone far enough. By 1152, Harold's success had become more than an innovation. It had become a revolution. And revolutions, as any student of history will tell you, have a way of making very powerful people very angry very quickly. The Guild of Salters had controlled food preservation since Roman times. Picture the most powerful trade union you can imagine, then multiply that power by 10 and give it the blessing of both church and crown. For over 800 years, they had held the monopoly on keeping food from rotting. Every castle, every monastery, every merchant who wanted to ship meat across more than a day's journey had to use guild-approved methods and guild-certified salt. They didn't just control a trade, they controlled survival itself. And now some peasant from nowhere, some upstart with his mysterious smoking methods, was threatening to tear down an empire that had stood since before the Anglo-Saxons set foot on British soil. Guildmaster Edmund the Cruel earned his name through methods that would make a modern mob boss blush. When Harold's preserved meats began appearing in London markets at half the price of salt-cured goods, Edmund didn't respond with better products or competitive pricing. He responded the way medieval power always responded to threats, with violence wrapped in righteousness. The first attack came on the Feast of St. Bartholomew. Flemish assassins, hired with guild gold, crept into Thornwick under cover of darkness. They poisoned Harold's well with a mixture that turned the water black and killed 3 village dogs before anyone realized what had happened. 2 nights later, they torched Harold's smallest smokehouse, the one where he experimented with new wood combinations. The building burned so hot that the stone foundation cracked, and the smell of charred meat hung over the village for weeks. But the assassins made one critical mistake. They underestimated English peasant justice. When young Tom the miller's son caught 2 of them trying to sabotage the main smokehouse, the entire village rose up like an angry hive. The Flemish killers were caught, interrogated by methods that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition, and hanged from the same oak tree where the village had celebrated harvest festivals for 3 centuries. Guildmaster Edmund escalated in response. He travelled to the Bishop of Thornwick, whose brother just happened to be a high-ranking member of the Salters Guild, a coincidence that would have seemed suspicious in a less corrupt age. The bishop, a man whose devotion to God was exceeded only by his devotion to gold, excommunicated Harold from the pulpit on the Feast of St. Michael. Standing before a congregation that included Harold's own family, the bishop declared that meat preserved beyond God's natural season was an invitation for demons to enter Christian souls. He proclaimed that Harold's methods violated the natural order established by the Almighty, that extending the life of dead flesh was tantamount to necromancy. The congregation sat in stunned silence as their spiritual father branded their economic savior as a servant of Satan. But Harold had spent too long fighting winter to be intimidated by threats wrapped in scripture. He stood up in that church, in front of God and the bishop and half the county, and made a declaration that would echo through history. "If feeding the hungry is the devil's work," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the stone sanctuary, "then I serve a more merciful master than you do." The words hung in the air like incense. Half the congregation gasped. The other half began to murmur approval. Because these people had lived through the hungry winters, had watched children die for lack of preserved food, had buried neighbors who might have lived if meat could be kept fresh longer. The conflict exploded into open warfare on that very night, the night of burning salt, as the chronicles would later call it. Apprentice smokers battled guild enforcers in Thornwick's narrow streets, using smoking forks as weapons, wielding fire pokers like swords. Women threw boiling brine from windows while children pelted guild soldiers with stones and rotten vegetables. The smell of smoke and blood mixed in the autumn air as neighbors fought neighbors, as economic revolution clashed with ancient privilege. Master Catherine of York, Harold's most skilled apprentice, led a group of village women in defending the main smokehouse. They barricaded themselves inside and kept the fires burning while guild soldiers tried to break down the doors. For 6 hours, the future of food preservation literally hung in the balance as smoke continued to rise from those sacred fires. The King's Guard intervened only when the fighting threatened to spread to the royal granaries on the village outskirts. 37 people died that night, men and women who had lived their entire lives within a few miles of each other, now killing each other over the right to preserve meat. Medieval England had seen many battles, but this was the first time people had died fighting over technology instead of territory. In the aftermath, with bodies still being counted and buildings still smouldering, both sides realized that this conflict needed resolution more sophisticated than street fighting. The solution came from an unexpected source: Queen Eleanor herself, who had been following the preservation wars with keen interest. As a woman who understood the challenges of feeding armies and maintaining households, she recognized that Harold's innovations could transform not just individual survival, but the entire economy of preservation. The Queen proposed the trial of 3 winters, an ancient test that hadn't been used for over 2 centuries. Both sides would preserve identical cuts of meat using their preferred methods. The preserved meat would be sealed with official marks and stored in the neutral ground of the abbey. Whoever's meat survived 3 complete winters would gain monopoly rights over all preservation methods in the kingdom. Magnus the Red, master of the Northern Salters and Edmund's chosen champion, accepted the challenge immediately. Magnus was a giant of a man whose red beard reached nearly to his belt, whose hands could crush salt crystals to powder, whose family had been preserving meat since the days of King Arthur. He had never lost a preservation contest, had never seen his methods fail, had never met a piece of meat he couldn't keep fresh through sheer skill and properly applied salt. The competition became a spectacle that drew thousands. Nobles travelled from Scotland and Wales to witness this clash between ancient tradition and revolutionary innovation. Merchants placed bets that totaled over 10,000 silver marks. The church sent observers to ensure that no unholy methods were employed. Even foreign dignitaries arrived, recognizing that the outcome would influence trade throughout Europe. Harold's method involved 72 hours of cold smoking with his secret wood combination: oak for strength, apple for sweetness, pine for preservation, each burned in precise sequence, according to lunar timing. The meat was then coated in herb-infused tallow that included the precious alpine starflower, creating a barrier that sealed in freshness like armor seals in a night. Magnus employed the traditional heavy salting with saltpeter, adding his own innovation of burial in consecrated earth from the monastery graveyard. His theory was that earth blessed by centuries of Christian prayer would add divine protection to the natural preservation properties of salt. Side wagers reached levels that threatened to destabilize local currency. Farmers bet their livestock, merchants their shops, nobles their estates. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself placed 1,000 gold marks on Magnus, declaring that God would surely favor traditional methods over innovation that bordered on heresy. Queen Eleanor attended the final sealing ceremony, watching as both men placed their preserved meats into identical stone containers marked with royal seals. The containers were locked in the abbey's deepest vault, guarded by monks sworn to neutrality, protected by both royal decree and ecclesiastical authority. And then began the longest 3 years in Thornwick's history. Harold continued his work, but under constant scrutiny. Guild spies watched his every move. Church investigators questioned his methods and his motives. The entire English economy of food preservation held its breath, waiting to see whether innovation or tradition would claim victory. What none of them knew, what couldn't possibly have been predicted, was that victory would come with a price that would make Harold question whether some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, whether some innovations extract a cost too terrible to justify even the greatest benefits. The alpine starflower that made Harold's preservation possible was about to reveal its darkest secret. 3 winters, 1,095 days, 26,280 hours. The people of Thornwick could have told you exactly how long they had been waiting, because every sunrise brought them closer to vindication or devastation. When the abbey doors finally opened on that crisp March morning in 1155, half of England seemed to be watching. Queen Eleanor had returned, accompanied by a delegation that included bishops, guildmasters, foreign merchants, and representatives from every major preservation house in Europe. The betting had reached such levels that several minor nobles had actually mortgaged their estates on the outcome. Brother Francis, the abbey's most senior monk, approached the sealed containers with the reverence usually reserved for handling holy relics. 3 years of speculation, of hope and fear, and economic uncertainty, all came down to this moment. The royal seals were intact, the locks showed no signs of tampering, Whatever lay inside those stone containers would reshape the future of food preservation across the known world. Magnus the Red's container opened first, releasing an odor that made even the hardiest observers step back. The meat that emerged was a lesson in the limits of traditional methods. What had been carefully preserved, venison, was now a mass of white mold and corruption that crumbled to powder at the slightest touch. The saltpeter had held for 2 winters, had fought the good fight against decay, but in the end, chemistry had won over tradition. Harold's container opened to a sight that seemed to violate the very laws of nature. His meat remained perfect, supple, sweet-smelling, the color of autumn oak leaves. When Brother Francis cut into it with his ceremonial knife, the blade moved through it like it was cutting fresh-killed venison. The smell that rose from the cut was not the smell of preserved meat, but the smell of a hunt completed that very morning. The crowd fell silent. Then, slowly, Harold raised his victory cup, accepting the cheers that erupted from his supporters, the grudging acknowledgement from his rivals, the blessing of Queen Eleanor herself. He had not just won a contest, he had proven that human innovation could triumph over ancient limitation, that knowledge could defeat ignorance, that the future could be better than the past. But as Harold stood there, basking in triumph that would make him wealthy beyond imagination, observers noticed something that chilled them more than the March wind. His hands were shaking, not with excitement or emotion, but with the tremor of a man far older than his years. His once brown hair had turned white as fresh snow. The face that had been young and strong when he entered the Black Forest 7 years earlier now bore lines that belonged on a man of 60 winters. You see, the keeper's herbs carried a price that no one had mentioned, a cost written in the very cells of Harold's body. The alpine starflower that prevented decay in meat also poisoned the blood of those who worked with it year after year. The same properties that stopped rot in preserved flesh slowly corrupted the life force of the preserver himself. Harold had traded his own years for the ability to preserve the years of others. Every perfect piece of sate, meat that emerged from his smokehouses, cost him days of his own life. The irony was as bitter as it was complete. The man who had conquered time itself was running out of time. In the months following his victory, Harold aged 20 winters in what should have been 20 weeks. His joints twisted like winter branches, his breath came short, as if he were climbing mountains with every step. The village that had celebrated him as a hero now watched him fade with the same helpless grief they had once felt watching loved ones succumb to winter hunger. On his deathbed, looking 70 years old at the actual age of 37, Harold made a decision that would cement his legacy forever. He called for Catherine of York, his most gifted apprentice, and revealed to her the complete method, every herb, every timing, every secret technique he had learned from the keeper and discovered through his own experimentation. But more importantly, he made her swear an oath that would change history. She must not hoard this knowledge for personal gain, must not sell it only to the highest bidder, must not let it die with her as the keeper had nearly allowed. Instead, she must spread it freely, teach it to anyone willing to learn, ensure that the ability to preserve food would never again be the monopoly of guild or nobleman or church. Catherine honoured that oath with a dedication that would have made Harold proud. She established schools from Scotland to Sicily, training preservers who trained other preservers, creating a network of knowledge that spread like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Each region adapted the technique to local conditions and preferences. The French added lavender and wine, creating preservation methods that turned humble meat into delicacies fit for royal tables. Germans incorporated juniper and beer, producing preserved meats that could sustain armies through the longest campaigns. Italians used rosemary and olive oil, developing techniques that are still used in modern salami production. The innovation enabled transformations that reached far beyond individual survival. The Crusaders could march further into hostile territory, carrying preserved food that lasted months without spoiling. Merchants could trade across vast distances, shipping preserved goods from London to Constantinople without fear of loss. Explorers could venture beyond the edge of known maps, confident that their food supplies would not fail them in uncharted territories. Cities grew larger as food security improved. The population of London doubled within 50 years of Harold's victory, fed partly by preserved meats that allowed urban populations to survive without depending entirely on fresh, local sources. The economic effects rippled through every level of society. Farmers could preserve surplus meat from good years to sell in lean years, stabilizing both prices and nutrition across the economic spectrum. But perhaps the most profound change was in the relationship between humanity and winter itself. For thousands of years, winter had been humanity's greatest enemy, the season when the weak died and the strong merely survived. Harold's methods transformed winter from executioner to merely another season, a time when preserved plenty could sustain life as surely as summer's fresh abundance. 8 centuries later, in 1998, workers renovating Thornwick Abbey made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Behind a wall marked with Harold's personal sign, a star within a circle of smoke, they found a sealed chamber that had remained untouched since the 12th century. Inside lay 50 pounds of various meats, each piece carefully tagged with dates ranging from 1153 to 1158. University tests confirmed what seemed impossible. The meat remained free of harmful bacteria, the proteins intact, the cellular structure preserved in a way that defied everything modern science understood about decay and time. Theoretically, the meat was still edible. The discovery sparked intense debate in academic circles. How had medieval preservation techniques achieved results that modern science could barely explain? What combination of timing, temperature, and natural chemistry had created preservation so perfect that it transcended centuries? The Smokemasters Guild, still active today with chapters throughout Europe and North America, maintains Harold's tomb in Thornwick. Every autumn, on the anniversary of his first successful preservation, they perform the ceremony of first smoke, honouring the man who conquered winter itself and paid for that conquest with his own mortality. Standing in that ancient churchyard, watching smoke rise from ceremonial fires that echo techniques perfected 900 years ago, you can almost hear Harold's voice on the wind. The boy who entered the Black Forest to save his father's life became the man who saved countless lives from winter's hunger. His legacy lives on in every piece of preserved meat, every safely stored food, every person who has survived harsh seasons because someone else learned to make plenty last through scarcity. Harold of Thornwick proved that innovation requires courage, that knowledge demands sacrifice, and that sometimes the greatest victories come with the heaviest prices. He faced winter as humanity's ancient enemy and emerged victorious, though victory cost him everything he had to give. In the end, he achieved something far rarer than mere success. He achieved immortality through transformation, not in his own flesh, which failed him far too young, but in the countless lives his innovation preserved, the countless winters that no longer meant death, the countless tomorrows made possible by his willingness to pay today's price for forever's gain. The smoke still rises from Thornwick, carrying with it the memory of a man who refused to accept that winter must always win, who looked at ancient limitation and decided that innovation could do better. In a world where preservation means survival, Harold's legacy continues to smoke, to cure, to preserve not just meat, but hope itself against the hunger of tomorrow.